The screen door hung off its hinges in May 1980. Investigators discovered the body of 18-year-old Christine Monroe in the hallway of the little rented home on Woodland Avenue, still dressed in her waitressing uniform from the night shift. The money tips she had gotten remained unopened on the kitchen counter. In the bedroom, her small daughter slept without disturbance. She would never wake her for breakfast once more. The violence of the crime rocked the city of Clarksville. While her youngster slept close, mother was assaulted in her own house. Detectives followed leads through the transient population of the military town, but the killer appeared to disappear like smoke. Years turned to decades. The case file collected dust. Christine's daughter grew up without answers, bearing questions weighted more than memories. Then, 41 years after that terrible night in 2021, a database match resurrected a cold inquiry. The arrest that followed stunned Clarksville. Not only, it shattered assumptions concerning who killers are and how long they can hide in plain sight. But how can a murder stay unsolved for 4 decades in a town where everyone knows everybody? And what does justice mean when it arrives a lifetime too late? Please hit subscribe and like this video before we go on with this shocking account. Your support helps to bring these lost stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. On May 1980, the screen door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside the little rental house on Christine Monroe lay motionless in the tiny corridor between the kitchen and bedroom. Still clad in the polyester uniform from her night shift at the Highway 41 diner. Her name tag, slightly skewed, captured the morning light filtering through thin curtains and illuminated a scene that would torment Clarksville, Tennessee for more than 4 decades. It said Christine in cheerful red lettering. She was 18 years old. Unchanged on the Formica kitchen counter, $17.43 in dimes and pennies, revenue from serving late-night travelers and truckers their pie and coffee. The money lay next to her car keys and a half-empty packet of Virginia Slims, ordinary items that now acted as silent witnesses to something unthinkable. 2-year-old Angela Monroe slept peacefully in her crib in the little bedroom at the end of the hall, oblivious that her mother would never wake her for breakfast again. The only sound in the... Marjorie Hendress, the neighbor from across the street, knocked on the door that morning but received no response. When she left for her own early work at the textile plant, Marjorie saw Christine's car in the driveway. That was not uncommon. What upset her was the front door standing slightly ajar, the screen door hanging loose. Christine was careful about locks, particularly since she lived alone with her daughter. The young mother had confided her fears to Marjorie more than once during their short fence-top chats. A solitary woman in a military town had to be wary. She stepped inside, her work shoes tapping on the linoleum floor, and saw her when Marjorie pushed the door open and yelled Christine's name. A heavy, erroneous silence. 3 other neighbors sprinted after the scream. One person had the wherewithal to check on the infant. Another called the police. Marjorie froze at the door, unable to interpret what her eyes were seeing. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on May 17, 1980, and the Clarksville Police Department got it. Within minutes, officers arrived to find a crime scene that would infuriate detectives for decades. The house showed no indicators of coerced entry. From the inside, the windows were closed and unbroken. The rear door was closed with its chain latch. Someone who had come into the house on Woodland Avenue either had a key or Christine herself had shown them in. Detective Raymond Cole was 34 years old. Having examined bar fights that resulted in death, domestic arguments that ended in sadness, and one case involving a robbery gone bad, he had been processing homicides for 6 years when he arrived at the scene. But the sight of Christine Monroe's body, so young and still attired for work, touched him in ways he could not put into words. The brutality of the attack contrasted dramatically with the calm orderliness of the other home. With great care, the crime scene unit documented everything: the hallway where Christine had fallen, the kitchen counter with untouched money, the living room with sparse furnishings and television set, the bedroom where little Angela had somehow slept through whatever terror had unfolded just feet from her crib. Each photograph recorded a life interrupted, frozen in the moment before everything changed. Christine's purse sat on the coffee table. Her wallet included her driver's license and a faded photo of Angela as a newborn. There was no sign that the motivation had been theft. The television stayed still. Christine's dresser held a small jewelry box with a few untouched, inexpensive items.
This had been something different altogether, something more intimate, darker. The medical examiner got in at 9:15 a.m. His first evaluation verified the officer's hunch. Christine had been strangled. The assault had been relentless and intense. On her hands and forearms, defensive injuries showed how fiercely she had struggled to survive. Another level of grief to an already heartbreaking scene was the idea that she had suffered as her daughter lay nearby. First, Detective Cole questioned Marjorie Hendricks, diligently recording her description of discovering Christine's body. Marjorie's hands trembled as she spoke, and she continued to apologize for yelling as though her response to finding a murder victim needed an apology. Cole gently reassured her, inquiring about Christine's daily schedule, her guests, anybody who may have been keeping an eye on the house. Marjorie knew little beyond the surface details. Christine was quiet, polite, worked hard to support her daughter. She had moved to Clarksville 6 months earlier from somewhere in Kentucky, though she rarely spoke about her past. There was no father in the picture, at least not one that Marjorie had ever seen. Christine seemed to prefer keeping to herself, which was understandable for a young single mother trying to build a life in a new town. By noon, the little house on Woodlawn Avenue had become the center of a big inquiry. Yellow crime scene tape ran across the front lawn, dividing the normal world from the horror that had taken place within. Locals gathered on the sidewalk, muttering to one another and trying to figure out how such a violent event might occur on their peaceful street. Out of respect, the Highway 41 diner, where Christine had worked her last shift, shut for the day. Her coworkers gathered in little groups, crying and trying to comprehend the loss. The owner, a seasoned man named Speaking to Detective Cole in the diner's parking lot, Frank Patterson said, his voice cracking as he depicted Christine as dependable, friendly, never any trouble. She had locked the restaurant alone the night before, just as she had done numerous times. Frank regretted not demanding someone stroll her to her car. The last person to see Christine alive, as far as anybody could ascertain, was a truck driver who had stopped for coffee around 1:30 a.m. He remembered her because she had been nice to him, not hurrying him even though the place was empty and refilling his cup without invitation. He had driven northward toward Kentucky with a $2 tip. By the time 3 days later Detective Cole found him, the trucker had an ironclad alibi and no helpful information to give. That evening, Christine's parents arrived from Louisville, looking older before the investigators' eyes, with a grief so great it seemed to age them. They had cautioned their daughter about settling in Clarksville on her own with a baby. But Christine had set out to create an autonomous life, to show she could support Angela without anyone's assistance. Now her goal resulted in this: a morgue identification and burial arrangements for a daughter decades ahead from them. Investigators put together what had happened while little Angela was housed briefly with her grandparents. The child was too young to grasp why her mother wasn't coming home, too young to provide any information regarding that evening. She had been spared the trauma of witnessing the attack, but she would grow up bearing the burden of her mother's unresolved murder. Detective Cole stood in the empty house on Woodlawn Avenue as the sun set on that first horrific day, trying to comprehend the mind of the perpetrator. The killer had entered without force, assaulted with fury, and left without taking anything of value. This implied someone Christine knew, someone she had trusted enough to let inside. But the young lady had lived so quietly and her circle of friends had been so small that who among them was capable of such violence? The evidence collected that day filled multiple boxes. Fingerprints taken from doorknobs and surfaces, fibers gathered from Christine's clothing, samples retrieved from under her fingernails where she had scratched at her attacker. Forensic science provided few possibilities for examination in 1980. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Collected would be stored, waiting for technology to catch up with the inquiries investigators could not answer. The Clarksville Police Department set up a tip hotline. The phone rang non-stop during the first week. People described suspicious vehicles, odd men, and rumors regarding Christine's private life. Detective Cole and his team pursued every tip with careful diligence, yet every path appeared to end in disappointment. Complicating affairs was the military base at nearby Fort Campbell. Thousands of soldiers rotated through the area. Any one of them could have met Christine at the diner or somewhere else in town. The inquiry had eaten hundreds of man-hours by the end of May, with no likely suspects. Witness statements and forensic reports expanded the case file, yet the fundamental query remained unaddressed. Who murdered Christine Monroe, and why? The screen door was finally fixed. The yellow tape came down. Life on Woodlawn Avenue gradually resumed its usual pace, but the memory of what had transpired in that tiny rental home hung like a stain that could not be removed. And boxes of evidence waited for their chance to speak in a storage facility in Clarksville.
The murder of Christine Monroe consumed the Clarksville Police Department throughout the summer of 1980. Fueled by the picture of that little woman lying in her hallway, still clothed for work, Detective Raymond Cole worked 16-hour days. The investigation into Christine Monroe's death became personal in a way that concerned his wife, who watched him grow thinner and more preoccupied over the weeks without a breakthrough. The first significant lead came from Christine's co-workers at the Highway 41 eatery. A regular client, Sergeant Michael Dodson from Fort Campbell, had shown especially interest in Christine over the previous several months. He consistently asked for her section, left lavish tips, and once asked Christine out for beverages following her shift. She had politely declined, stating she didn't date customers. Several waitresses recalled Dodson's face, though he had continued to visit the diner, darkening at the rejection. Detective Cole brought Dodson in for questioning on May 24th. The sergeant arrived in full uniform, confident and cooperative. He admitted to finding Christine attractive, but denied any fury over her rejection. On the night of the murder, he claimed to have been on base, a story corroborated by the guard logs at Fort Campbell's main gate. His entry time matched his account. His fingerprints, taken for elimination purposes, didn't match any of the unidentified prints discovered in Christine's home. Cole left upset from the interview. Dodson had opportunity and motive, yet his alibi withstood. Though emotions weren't evidence, the detective couldn't help but sense the sergeant knew more than he was telling. Dodson's alibi held because there was no tangible evidence tying him to the crime scene. June brought another possible suspect. Christine's former boyfriend from Kentucky, a man named David Richter, had been calling the diner repeatedly in the weeks leading up to her death. Frank Patterson recalled Christine's apparent agony during one particular phone call, her murmured cries for David to stop contacting her. The relationship had concluded poorly, though Christine never shared specifics with her colleagues. She had relocated to Clarksville partially to get rid of whatever relationship they had. Richter first declined to speak with Tennessee investigators, citing his rights and demanding they follow correct channels. When Cole finally tracked him down in Louisville, the ex-boyfriend was belligerent and protective. He acknowledged contacting Christine, but claimed he was only trying to arrange child custody for Angela. Though he had never bothered to establish paternity legitimately or provide financial help, the child was his daughter, he insisted.
The alibi Richter offered was less firm than Dodson's. He claimed to have been working a night shift at an auto parts factory, but his supervisor could not definitely verify his presence throughout the entire shift. Richter often sneaked out for cigarette breaks or personal errands. The trip from Louisville to Clarksville lasted fewer than 2 hours. Richter might have made the trip, committed the murder, and returned before dawn undetected. Detective Cole asked Richter for hair samples and fingerprints. Reluctantly, the man complied with the lawyer, counseling him to not say anything farther. The hair samples were sent for comparison with fibers discovered on Christine's body. The forensic techniques of 1980 could not offer the final answers investigators so much wanted. Much of the summer investigation was focused on the Fort Campbell angle. Clarksville lived under the shadow of the vast military installation, and the transient nature of military life produced endless problems. Soldiers rotated in and out regularly. A man stationed at Campbell in May might be reallocated to Germany by July. Finding eyewitnesses and possible suspects turned into a logistical catastrophe that stressed the department's scarce resources. Cole created a list of every soldier who had been processed via Fort Campbell in the 6 months before Christine's murder. The list included more than 3,000 names. Cross-referencing those names with the diner's credit card receipts and witness accounts reduced the pool somewhat, yet hundreds of possible suspects remained. Everyone called for an interview, an alibi check, and elimination through whatever forensic means were accessible. The sheer volume of investigative work necessitated military police and federal agents. The cooperation was professional but slow. Military bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and civilian homicide cases did not always receive priority. Cole spent hours on the phone, navigating chains of command and filling out paperwork that seemed designed to obstruct rather than assist. Leads were drying up by August, quicker than the Tennessee heat vaporized morning dew. The initial burst of public interest had passed. The local paper released less information. The tip line rang less often. Tired of hearing about the case without resolution, people wanted to believe that Clarksville was secure and that Christine's death was a one-time event that wouldn't happen again. Unable to bear the idea of raising Angela in the town, Christine's parents brought her back to Louisville indefinitely, where her mother had been murdered. The grandparents' grief was made more complex by rage at the police department's inaction in making an arrest. They contacted Detective Cole weekly, requesting status reports and venting their aggravation at the lack of movement. He felt their anguish, but had no consolation to provide beyond his unrelenting dedication to finding answers. The department's storage room held evidence boxes: hair fibers, fingerprint cards, witness statements, crime scene images. Each item was precisely categorized and cataloged and protected against the day forensic science could advance enough to expose their secrets. In September 1980, however, much of what had been gathered stayed frustratingly quiet. Detective Cole asked the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for help. 2 agents from the TBI looked over the case file and performed their own interviews. Their analysis was blunt.
Without eyewitnesses who could place someone at Christine's residence that evening, and without physical evidence straight connecting a suspect to the crime, the case was dormant. They advised staying open to other possibilities while yet developing the military aspect. The first anniversary of Christine's murder came and gone in May 1981 without resolution. Her parents were present, along with a handful of former co-workers and neighbors. Detective Cole stood in the rear of the event, both out of respect and as a reminder of unfinished business. By 1982, Cole had been promoted to sergeant. He was given administrative duties that pulled him away from active fieldwork. He kept going through Christine's file whenever he could find free time, but fresh homicides called for resources and focus. Cold cases were expected, under the unwritten rule of the department, to get attention when nothing more pressing was needed. Christine's case accumulated dust more often than not in a city short-handed and with increasing crime rates. Other detectives periodically examined the case, hoping fresh eyes might see something Cole had missed. Each arrived away with the same annoyance. The case was theoretically solvable, but given the constraints of forensic science in the 1980s and the complexity of the military connection, it was impossible. Either the murderer had been exceptionally fortunate or quite cautious, perhaps both. The evidence boxes were sent to a climate-controlled storage facility in 1985 when the police department moved to new quarters. Box cataloged and designated a new location code. The objective was to store everything against future review, but in reality the relocation seemed like a funeral, out of sight, out of mind. The case that had previously drawn departmental attention was now just another open file among many lining the storage shelves. Retired Detective Cole in 1995, 15 years after Christine's death. His goodbye address made no mention of the case, but coworkers who knew him well understood Christine Monroe stayed his biggest professional failure. He brought copies of some papers home as unofficial mementos, stored in a file cabinet in his garage. On sleepless nights, he would frequently retrieve the crime scene pictures and witness statements, looking for the detail he had seemingly missed. Around Christine's unsolved murder, the world altered. Criminal investigations adopted DNA profiling as standard procedure, but cold cases called for financial and governmental will to reopen. While departments concentrated on solving present crimes rather than re-examining long-ago mistakes, the boxes in storage remained sealed with their contents safe but forgotten by everyone, except the family who would never stop inquiring. Angela Monroe grew up knowing her mother just through images and secondhand tales. She learned that Christine had been murdered when she was old enough to grasp death, but too small to handle the magnitude of what had been taken from her. The enigma of who murdered her, 10 years after the killing, in 1990, the case file formally changed to cold status. The term was procedural instead of significant. The case had been effectively cold since 1982, when active probes stopped, owing lack of believable leads. But the official label felt like a last abandonment, an acknowledgement that justice for Christine Monroe would most likely never reach. And the evidence waited in the storage facility's climate-controlled dark mat. DNA samples degraded slowly, but stayed stable enough for future analysis. Fingerprint cards maintained their clarity. Crime scene pictures kept in acid-free sleeves showed details that no one had examined in years. Everything needed to solve the case was in those boxes awaiting technology and tenacity to finally converge. Continue capital 3 decades. The years passed with the relentless indifference that time shows to unsolved tragedies. Clarksville grew and modernized. The Highway 41 diner changed ownership twice before finally closing in 1998, replaced by a chain restaurant that bore no memory of the young waitress who had once served coffee there. The little house on Woodlawn Avenue was rented to new tenants who knew nothing of what had transpired in the hallway. Life moved forward because it had no choice. Angela Monroe turned 10 in 1988, then 20 in 1998, then 30 in 2008. Each birthday was marked by the same ritual. Her grandmother would bake a cake, made according Christine's favorite recipe, would be looked over the picture album, including all her mother had. There were few of them. 18 images taken over 18 years. Christine cradling infant Angela in the hospital, smiling for the camera, Christine in her waitress uniform, Christine as a young child herself, gap-toothed and optimistic. As she got older, Angela's inquiries changed. As a child, she wondered if her mother was in heaven. She demanded to know as a teenager. As an adult, Angela questioned whether she would ever cease feeling the loss of someone she could not consciously recall. Her grandmother had no answers beyond platitudes about God's plan and the enigma of evil. The non-answers felt worse than silence. Angela first visited Clarksville by herself in 2003. She drove down Highway 41, the same route that her mother had taken to work that final evening when she was 25 years old.
The cemetery where Christine was buried sat peaceful and well-kept at the edge of the town. The headstone was basic: Christine Marie Monroe, 1962 to 1980, cherished mother and daughter.
Angela sobbed for a woman she had never really known while kneeling in the grass. She found the house on Woodlawn Avenue later that day. She had imagined it bigger, more common. In the front yard sat a child's bike. Wind chimes dangled from the patio. Whoever resided there now had made it their own, removing any evidence of the brutality that had happened inside those walls. Angela sat in her car across the street for nearly an hour, seeking to conjure some memory, some connection to that evening. Nothing came. She had been 2 years old, asleep in her crib. For her, the murder of her mother was just story, not lived experience. The Clarksville Police Department still kept Christine's case file, though it had been migrated to digital storage in 2001. During that 2003 visit, a clerk retrieved the documents for Angela, enabling her to review witness statements and police reports in a tiny conference room. Though Angela read every word anyway, the clinical language of law enforcement could not capture the emotional reality of what had been lost. She had to comprehend what had been done to track down her mother's killer and why it had not been enough. At 73 years old in 2010, Detective Raymond Cole lived in a neatly kept ranch house on the margins of Clarksville. Retired for 15 years, but still sharp-minded and tormented by the cases he had never closed. Angela knocked at his door and introduced herself. She saw his expression crack. He had been looking for this visit for 30 years. Surrounded by boxes of unapproved case records he had preserved, they sat in his garage. Cole guided Angela through the probe step by step, describing their actions and why it hadn't been sufficient. He begged repeatedly, his voice cracking with feeling time had not reduced. He had failed her. The forensic restrictions of 1980, the intricacy of the military connection, the dearth of witnesses. Mother. He had let her down. Angela left Cole's house carrying witness accounts, crime scene sketches, photos she couldn't bring herself to view closely, and copies of papers he wasn't meant to have kept. She also left with something unexpected: a conviction that the individuals who had handled her mother's case had really cared. They had merely been defeated by situations outside of their control. They had not overlooked Christine. The local newspaper ran anniversary pieces on Christine's kill every 5 years. The oldest cold case in Clarksville read one headline in 2005. Justice postponed, 30 years without answers, stated another in 2010. The stories repeated the same basic facts, quoted the same retired detectives, and produced the same lack of fresh information. Readers would write sympathy and internet comments, then continue on to other topics. Christine had grown to be a historical footnote in her small hometown, a warning tale about threats that looked distant and abstract. Social networking changed the true crime fans, established Facebook groups devoted to unsolved murders, whereas amateur detectives discussed theories and examined evidence on Reddit threads. Christine's case drew interest from these online communities, particularly after Angela made a Justice for Christine Monroe page in 2012, which garnered thousands of followers. Theories, sympathy, and sometimes true investigative observations were given by others around the nation. Others pointed to patterns in comparable unresolved cases from the same period among the suspects. Though often insensitive and overpowering, the gossip thrilled Angela. The attention she got was really appreciated. People were still discussing Christine and asking questions 32 years after her mother died. When Detective Cole passed in 2014, he took with him years of investigative experience never properly recorded. Though his obituary listed his illustrious career, it made no mention of the cases haunting him. Angela was present at the funeral and was surprised to find several other people there for the same reason: families of victims whose murders Cole had worked but never solved. They formed an unintentional support group bound by shared grief and the same unanswered questions. The Clarksville Police Department underwent major modernization in 2015. A new chief of police, appointed with a mandate to increase transparency and community trust, made cold cases a priority. A small unit was established to review unsolved homicides using modern forensic techniques. Christine's case, the first file retrieved from digital storage, was case.
Detective Sarah Noonian was 36 years old when she took over Christine Monroe's case, young enough to provide fresh energy, experienced enough to appreciate the emotional gravity of cold case investigations. She had grown up in Clarksville and dimly remembered hearing about the murder as a child. Now she had the chance to do what an entire generation of investigators before her had failed to do. Noonian's first step was to find the physical proof acquired in 1980. The boxes had been shifted 3 times over decades, shuffled between storage facilities as the department's needs changed. Finding them required days of searching through climate-controlled warehouses filled with the detritus of decades of police work. She finally located the Monroe-Christine case boxes, number 80147. They were covered in dust, but intact. The evidence had been preserved remarkably well. Glass slides containing hair fibers, envelopes with nail finger scrapings, and swabs taken from Christine's body that may have her assailant's DNA. These items had been gathered hopefully in 1980, but processed with restricted technology. Forensic science had developed tremendously 35 years thereafter. What had been useless in 1980 might be the key to everything. Noonian sent samples to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory in 2015 requesting full DNA analysis.
The process would take months. DNA extraction from decades-old evidence was a difficult job, requiring patience and particular methods. If, though, a feasible profile could be created, it might at last address the issue that had lasted for 35 years. Who was responsible for Christine Monroe's death? Angela got a phone call from Detective Nuwan in October 2015. Their talk was short and carefully phrased. They were looking into the case again. New scientific tests were being done. They couldn't make any guarantees, but there was a glimmer of hope. Angela ended the call and cried, feeling emotions she couldn't quite understand. After years of disappointments, hope felt risky. The DNA tests confirmed what the detectives thought but couldn't prove. In 1980, there was foreign DNA found under Christine's nails, showing she had fought hard against whoever attacked her. The DNA profile was not complete, but it was enough to be compared if a suspect was found. The sample was added to CODIS, the national DNA database that has profiles of people convicted of serious crimes. They didn't find a match. This was frustrating, but it wasn't unexpected. CODIS only has profiles from those who were arrested and convicted for serious crimes that require DNA to be collected. If Christine's murderer had not been caught for any other crime, his DNA wouldn't be in the database. The DNA was important, but it needed a suspect to compare it with. Without that, it was just another piece of evidence without context. Detective Nuwan tried different approaches. She talked to surviving witnesses again, but most were old and couldn't remember much. She went over the old suspect list, trying to find men who were questioned back in 1980. Some had passed away, others had moved far away. None seemed worth trying to get DNA samples from, since that needed legal reasons the department didn't have. The investigation hit another dead end, but this time they had better tools and more support from the institution. The frustration was something anyone involved with the case knew well. The murder of Christine Monroe seemed solvable in theory, but it was still out of reach in reality. The killer had left DNA, but finding out who he was needed either a match in the database or smart detective work that had not happened for 40 years. Then in 2019, a new technology came out that would change everything. Forensic genetic genealogy helped catch the Golden State Killer in California by using public DNA sites and family trees to find a suspect who had escaped arrest for many years. This method was debated because of privacy issues and legal concerns, but it proved successful, making Detective Sarah Nguyen think it could help solve Christine Monroe's case. The success in the Golden State Killer case influenced police departments all over the country. Joseph James D'Angelo frightened people in California for years before he was finally arrested in 2018, using a method that seemed almost unreal. Investigators put DNA from the crime scene into a public genealogy database called GEDmatch and looked for family links
until they figured out who their suspect was. This approach was new, controversial, and very effective. Detective Sarah Nguyen went to a conference about forensic genetic genealogy in Nashville during the spring of 2019. She joined hundreds of other police officers in a hotel ballroom, all eager to find ways to solve old cases that had gone cold for a long time. The speakers shared how DNA testing for ancestry created large databases of genetic data. People wanting to discover their family history or find distant relatives had, without knowing it, created a huge tool for solving crimes. The method was complicated but smart. DNA from the crime scene would be uploaded to public databases using a fake name. The system would find genetic relatives, like third and fourth cousins, who share small bits of DNA with the unidentified suspect. Genetic genealogists would then create family trees, tracing back through generations until they found possible suspects. It was a mix of detective work and genetics, needing both scientific accuracy and traditional investigative skills. Nguyen went back to Clarksville feeling motivated and had a list of genetic genealogy businesses ready to collaborate with the police. However, this technique could be quite expensive. A single case can cost a lot of money, like tens of thousands of dollars, and it might take many months of hard work to investigate. However, the cold case unit of the Clarksville Police Department had a budget, and Christine Monroe's case had been waiting for too long. The first challenge was technical. The DNA sample from 1980 needed to be handled in a special way for family tree research, which uses different lab methods than what is normally done in crime investigations. The sample was sent to a lab in Virginia that had experience with old, damaged evidence from cold cases. The scientists there worked carefully to extract all usable pieces of DNA and create the best profile they could. By September 2019, they had completed the profile and were ready to upload it. Detective Nguyen collaborated with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, who had previously helped catch the Golden State Killer. Ray Venter was a leader in forensic genealogy, using her skills to help solve many cold cases across the country. She treated each case with great care and respect for the victims and their stories.
The DNA profile was uploaded to a website called GEDmatch under the name Woodlawn Jane Doe. In just a few hours, the system found many genetic matches, people who shared DNA with Christine's murderer. Most were distant relatives, like fourth and fifth cousins, who were connected to the suspect but not closely related. The closest match was a third cousin, a woman living in Oregon, who had no idea her DNA would help solve a 40-year-old murder. Ray Venter then began the slow process of creating family trees. She started with the closest matches and worked her way back through the generations, finding common ancestors who might have passed down DNA to both the match and the killer. Public records helped her map out the family connections. She looked at census data, birth certificates, marriage records, and obituaries. Each new document added another branch to the expanding tree. This work took months. Ray Venter would make some progress and then run into dead ends where records were missing or family lines broke apart in ways that made them hard to follow. She often talked with Detective Nguyen, giving updates and asking for extra help with the investigation. Nguyen found living relatives to interview but carefully avoided revealing the true reason for her questions. The family history had to stay private until it led to a possible suspect. By the start of 2020, the family lines had come together around a particular couple who lived in Tennessee in the 1800s. Their descendants spread out across the state, but one family line stayed in the Clarksville area for many years. Ray Venter found 6 men from this couple's descendants who would have been the right age in 1980 to have been involved in Christine's murder. These 6 possible suspects were narrowed down from a large number thanks to genetic science. Detective Nguyen started the careful job of looking into these men without sharing why she was investigating. She checked their backgrounds, including their criminal records, jobs, and where they lived. 3 of the 6 men had passed away since 1980, which was confirmed through public records and death certificates. This left 3 living suspects who needed more investigation. The first one was Robert Caldwell, who was 62 years old and lived in Nashville. He had a record of crimes, including assault and burglary from the 1990s. His DNA was already in the system, but he had never been flagged as a match for Christine's case because the tools used to check family connections were not the same as those for direct matches. Nguyen asked for a direct comparison between Caldwell's DNA and the DNA from the crime scene. The lab got back to her in a week. It wasn't a match. The second suspect was Michael Owens, who was 58 years old and lived in Memphis. He had no criminal record and had been an accountant at the same company for 30 years. His life seemed pretty normal. He was married, with 3 kids, and went to church. However, the genetics indicated he was related to Christine's murderer. Nguyen needed a DNA sample to compare, which meant she had to watch and carefully collect things he might have thrown away. She found a coffee cup in the trash outside Owen's office, which gave her the sample she needed. The lab took 2 weeks to analyze it. It wasn't a match either. That left one person. James Edward Coley was 63 years old and lived at 412 Riverside Drive, just a short drive from where Christine Moreau was killed 40 years ago. Nguyen gathered every record she could find about Coley. He had lived in Clarksville his whole life and graduated from the local high school in 1975. He had taken on different construction jobs during the 1980s and 1990s before he started his small contracting company. He was married and had 2 grown-up kids. Other than one speeding ticket from 1992, he had no criminal history. By all appearances, he was just a regular guy living a typical life in the town where he was born. But his family background connected him to Christine's murderer. When he was 23 years old in 1980, he matched the profile that investigators had figured out many years ago. Detective Cole's notes from 1980 suggested that the murderer was probably in their 20s or 30s, strong enough to take Christine by force. Coley would have been in great shape in May 1980. Nguyen drove by Coley's house several times over the next few weeks. It was a simple one-story house with a well-kept yard and an American flag hanging on the porch. There was a truck in the driveway with Coley Construction written on the side. Everything about the place felt very normal, a type of everyday life that seemed hard to connect with the violent crime of Christine's murder. The surveillance started in November 2020. Officers kept an eye on Coley's actions, noted his habits, and waited for a chance to get a piece of DNA he might throw away. The pandemic made everything trickier. Since people were home more often, there was less trash to collect secretly, making things harder for the investigators. But cold case detectives knew how to be patient. The chance came on December 3, 2020. Coley stopped at a gas station and bought a bottle of water which he drank while filling up his truck. After he was done, he threw the empty bottle in the station's trash can and drove off. An officer in a plain car waited for 15 minutes, then took the bottle from the trash, carefully putting it in a bag as evidence. The bottle was quickly sent to the TBI lab with the request for it to be analyzed right away. Detective Nguyen shared how urgent the situation was. 40 years had passed. The family was desperate for answers, and this case had troubled several generations of police officers. The lab prioritized the sample, working through the DNA extraction and comparison process with meticulous care. On January 12, 2021, Detective Sarah Nguyen received the phone call that would change everything. The lab supervisor's voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of excitement that couldn't be suppressed. The DNA from James Edward Coley's discarded water bottle matched the DNA found under Christine Monroe's fingernails in 1980. The statistical probability of the match was overwhelming, astronomical odds that left no room for reasonable doubt. Christine's killer had been identified. After 40 years, 9 months, and 26 days, the man who would strangle an 18-year-old waitress in her own hallway while her daughter slept nearby finally had a name. And he had been living in Clarksville the entire time, walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, breathing the same air as the family that mourned his victim. Detective Nguyen sat alone in her office after the phone call ended, staring at James Edward Coley's driver's license photo on her computer screen. He looked ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd without drawing attention. This was the man who had destroyed so many lives. And soon, very soon, he would be held accountable. February 10, 2021. The arrest warrant was signed at 6:47 a.m. Detective Sarah Nguyen had barely slept in the weeks since receiving DNA confirmation. The legal preparation required for an arrest in a 40-year-old case was extensive and meticulous. Every piece of evidence had to be documented, every link in the chain of custody verified, every legal precedent researched. The district attorney's office wanted the case to be bulletproof before moving forward. There would be no second chance if procedural errors compromised the prosecution. The warrant listed charges that made Nguyen's hands shake as she read them. First-degree murder, aggravated burglary. Each word represented a lifetime of grief for Christine's family, and decades of investigative work by officers who had never stopped searching for answers. Some of those officers were retired now. Some were dead. But their work had built the foundation that made this moment possible. The arrest team assembled at 7:30 a.m. in the police department's briefing room. 6 officers, the district attorney, and Detective Nguyen reviewed the tactical plan. James Edward Coley would be taken at his home before he left for work. The element of surprise was crucial. They needed to prevent any possibility of flight or destruction of evidence. Though what evidence could Coley destroy? After 4 decades, the question lingered unspoken in the room. Angela Monroe received a phone call from Detective Nguyen at 8:15 a.m. The conversation was brief and carefully controlled. An arrest was imminent in her mother's case. Details would follow. Angela should prepare herself for media attention. The detective's voice carried both triumph and caution. Justice was coming, but the process would be difficult in public. Angela sat on her couch in Louisville, phone still pressed to her ear long after the call ended. 43 years old, she had lived her entire life in the shadow of her mother's unsolved murder. Every birthday, every milestone, every achievement had been marked by the absence of the woman who should have been there to witness it. Now, finally, she would have answers, and a name, a face, an explanation for the void that had defined her existence. The arrest team arrived at 412 Riverside Drive at 9:03 a.m. The neighborhood was quiet, typical for a Wednesday morning when most residents had already left for work. Cooley's truck sat in the driveway. Lights were on inside the house. Detective Nguyen approached the front door with 2 uniformed officers flanking her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knocked. "James Edward Coley?" Detective Nguyen's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Yes?" He glanced between the officers, his confusion deepening. "What's this about?" "I'm Detective Sarah Nguyen with the Clarksville Police Department. I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Christine Maria Monroe on May 17, 1980. The color drained from Coley's face. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the concrete and sending brown liquid across the concrete. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. For several seconds, he simply stared at the detective, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. I didn't… His voice came out as a whisper. "That was 40 years ago." "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Nguyen's tone left no room for argument. Cooley complied mechanically, his body moving while his mind seemed to be somewhere else. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, with the sound that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. A neighbor walking her dog stopped to stare. Curtains moved in nearby windows as residents noticed the police presence. "You have the right to remain silent," Nguyen began the Miranda warning, speaking clearly and deliberately. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Cooley's wife appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "James, what's happening? What are they saying?" "Ma'am, please step back inside." An officer moved to block her view as Cooley was led toward the police car. Her cries followed them down the driveway, desperate and bewildered. "There's been a mistake! James, tell them there's been a mistake!" But Cooley said nothing. He walked to the police car in silence, his head down, his movements wooden. He didn't protest his innocence or demand a lawyer.
He simply submitted to the arrest with the passive resignation of a man who had been expecting this moment for 40 years and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived. The booking process at the Montgomery County Jail was documented with meticulous care. Fingerprints, photographs, DNA sample officially collected for the record. Cooley moved through each step with the same vacant expression, answering questions when required but offering nothing voluntary. He declined to make a statement without an attorney present. The only words he spoke during processing were his name, address, and date of birth. News of the arrest spread through Clarksville with viral speed. The local television station interrupted regular programming with breaking news. Arrest made in 40-year-old cold case murder. Cooley's booking photo appeared on screens across the city. A gray-haired man in his 60s, looking older than his years, his eyes empty and haunted. The community's reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media exploded with comments from people who knew Cooley or had worked with his construction company. "I can't believe it. He seemed so normal. He did work on my house just last year." The shock was palpable. James Edward Cooley wasn't a stranger or a drifter who had passed through town. He was one of them. He had lived among them for decades, hiding in plain sight. Former classmates from the high school class of 1975 shared their disbelief. Cooley had been quiet but unremarkable, an average student who played on the baseball team and worked part-time at a hardware store. Nothing in his teenage years had suggested he was capable of violence. But then people rarely broadcast their capacity for evil. Monsters didn't always look monstrous. The press conference was held at 2:01 p.m., 6 hours after the arrest. Police Chief David Morgan stood at a podium flanked by Detective Ningwan, the district attorney, and a representative from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Camera flashes created a strobe effect in the crowded room. Reporters from Nashville and Memphis had made the drive to cover the story. National news outlets had sent stringers. Cold cases solved through genetic genealogy were still novel enough to generate significant media interest. Chief Morgan's statement was measured and professional. He outlined the basics of the case without revealing sensitive details that might compromise the prosecution. Christine Monroe, 18 years old, murdered in her home in 1980. Investigation that continued for decades. New forensic technology that allowed investigators to identify a suspect through genetic genealogy. James Edward Cooley arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The questions from reporters came rapid fire. How was the DNA collected? What connected Cooley to the victim? Why did the case take 40 years to solve? Chief Morgan deflected questions that couldn't be answered without jeopardizing the legal process. We're confident in the evidence, the investigation was thorough, and the arrest is justified. We believe justice will be served. Detective Nguyen spoke briefly about the investigation, thanking the genealogists and forensic scientists who had made the breakthrough possible. She mentioned Detective Raymond Cole by name, honoring the man who had spent 15 years working the case before his retirement and death. This arrest stands on the shoulders of every investigator who refused to let Christine Monroe be forgotten, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Angela Monroe watched the press conference from her home in Louisville, tears streaming down her face. The detective had offered to fly her to Clarksville for the announcement, but Angela had declined. She needed to process this privately, away from cameras and microphones. Seeing Cooley's photo on the screen, this ordinary-looking man who had destroyed her family triggered emotions she couldn't name. Relief, rage, grief that felt fresh despite 4 decades of distance. The arraignment was scheduled for February 12th. Coley appeared via video link from the jail wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed too large for his frame. His court-appointed attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The judge denied bond, citing the severity of the charges and the defendant's potential flight risk. Coley's face remained expressionless throughout the brief hearing, as if he were watching something happening to someone else. The case files from 1980 were pulled from storage and delivered to the district attorney's office in boxes that required a cart to transport. Prosecutors began the work of building their case, reviewing every witness statement and piece of evidence collected 4 decades earlier. The DNA match was powerful, but they needed to construct a narrative that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Coley's wife hired a private attorney to replace the public defender, a sign that the family would fight the charges despite the overwhelming genetic evidence. The attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance from Nashville, immediately began preparing a defense strategy. She requested all discovery materials and announced her intention to challenge the use of genetic genealogy as a violation of her client's Fourth Amendment rights. The legal battle was beginning, but for the first time in 40 years, Christine Monroe's case was moving forward. The man who had killed her was in custody, his DNA preserved, and his freedom ended. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they were, finally, undeniably, turning. In the Clarksville cemetery, fresh flowers appeared on Christine's grave. Someone had placed them there within hours of the arrest. Pink roses, the same color that had adorned her casket in 1980. No note accompanied the flowers, they were simply there, a silent acknowledgement that Christine had not been forgotten, and that after 4 decades of waiting, her story was finally approaching its conclusion. The trial of James Edward Coley began on September 13, 2022, 18 months after his arrest. The delay had been necessary to navigate the complex legal challenges surrounding genetic genealogy evidence.
Patricia Vance had filed multiple motions to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the use of public genealogy databases constituted an illegal search. Each motion was denied, but the appeals process consumed months and generated legal precedents that would affect cold cases across the country. The courtroom in Montgomery County was packed on opening day. Angela Monroe sat in the front row, flanked by her husband and her now elderly grandmother. At 84, Christine's mother had lived long enough to see her daughter's killer face justice. The weight of 4 decades showed in the lines of her face and the tremor in her hands, but her eyes were sharp and fixed on the defendant. James Edward Coley sat at the defense table wearing a dark suit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight during his incarceration, his face gaunt and his hair completely gray. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the gaze of the gallery and the jury. Throughout the pretrial hearings, he had maintained his silence, speaking only to his attorney and offering no public statement about the charges. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant District Attorney Michael Ross, a veteran prosecutor who had handled dozens of murder cases. He outlined the evidence methodically, building a narrative that connected Coley to Christine's murder through science and circumstance. The DNA match was the cornerstone, but Ross supplemented it with context. Coley's age and residence in 1980, his lack of alibi, his suspicious behavior after the arrest. The defendant's DNA was found under Christine Monroe's fingernails, Ross told the jury, his voice steady and clear. That DNA didn't appear there by accident. Christine fought for her life that night. She clawed at her attacker, desperate to survive, desperate to return to her 2-year-old daughter. And in that desperate fight, she left us a message that would take 40 years to read. She left us her killer's identity. Patricia Vance's opening statement challenged the reliability of genetic genealogy and questioned the tunnel vision that had led investigators to focus exclusively on Coley. "The science is new," she told the jury. "The techniques are controversial. My client's DNA ending up in a database without his knowledge or consent raises serious constitutional questions. But beyond the legal concerns, ask yourself this: is a DNA match enough to convict someone of murder 40 years after the fact? Where's the other evidence? Where are the witnesses? Where's the motive?" The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks. Forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter testified about the process of building family trees and identifying Coley as a suspect. Her testimony was technical and detailed, explaining how genetic markers and family connections had converged on the defendant. The jury listened intently, some taking notes, others appearing overwhelmed by the complexity of the science. Dr. Patricia Wong, the forensic scientist who had analyzed the DNA samples, testified about the match between crime scene evidence and Coley's profile. She walked the jury through the statistical probability of the match, 1 in 3.7 trillion. The numbers were so large as to be almost meaningless, but their message was clear. The DNA under Christine's fingernails came from James Edward Coley. No other explanation was scientifically plausible. The defense challenged every aspect of the DNA evidence. Vance questioned the chain of custody for evidence stored for 40 years. She raised the possibility of contamination, though she couldn't explain how Coley's DNA would have contaminated samples collected in 1980. She suggested that genetic genealogy was unreliable, though she provided no scientific support for this claim. The challenges felt desperate, the arguments of an attorney working with limited material. Detective Sarah Nagoon testified about the investigation, walking the jury through the decades of work that had preceded Coley's identification. She spoke about Detective Raymond Cole and the other investigators who had worked the case before her. She described the moment when the DNA match was confirmed and the careful process of verifying Coley's identity before seeking an arrest warrant. Her testimony was emotional but controlled, her professionalism evident even as she discussed the devastating details of Christine's murder. The medical examiner's report from 1980 was entered into evidence, describing the cause of death as strangulation and documenting the defensive wounds on Christine's body. The photographs from the crime scene were shown to the jury. Clinical images of the hallway where Christine had died, the kitchen with its untouched money, the bedroom where Angela had slept through her mother's murder. Several jurors looked away from the photographs, their faces reflecting the horror that those images captured. Angela Monroe was called to testify about the impact of her mother's murder. She spoke about growing up without answers, about the void that had defined her childhood, about the decades of wondering who had killed her mother and why. Her voice broke multiple times as she testified, and the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of people quietly weeping. Even some jurors dabbed at their eyes. "I never knew my mother," Angela said, her words directed at the jury, but her gaze fixed on Coley. "I have no memories of her voice, her laugh, her touch. Everything I know about Christine Monroe comes from photographs and other people's stories. He took her from me before I was old enough to remember her. And then he went home to his own family, his own children, and lived his life as if nothing had happened." The defense case lasted only 3 days. Coley did not testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Vance called character witnesses who described the defendant as a quiet, hard-working man who had been a good neighbor and father.
She called an expert witness who questioned the reliability of genetic genealogy. Though the expert's credentials were less impressive than those of the prosecution's witnesses, the closing arguments crystallized the central question of the trial. The prosecution argued that DNA evidence was irrefutable proof of guilt. The defense argued that DNA alone, without corroborating evidence or motive, was insufficient for conviction. The jury would have to decide which argument was more persuasive. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. The courtroom was tense as they filed back in on September 28, 2022. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had taken extensive notes throughout the trial, stood to read the verdict. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper. In the matter of the state of Tennessee versus James Edward Coley on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in muted gasps and quiet sobs. Angela collapsed against her husband, her body shaking with the release of 42 years of tension. Christine's mother closed her eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Detective Ningwan sat motionless, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction before the emotional walls she had maintained throughout the trial finally cracked. James Edward Coley showed no visible reaction to the verdict. He sat perfectly still, his face blank, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. If he felt relief or fear or remorse, no trace of it showed on his features. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, disappearing through a side door without a word. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later, in November 2022. Judge Martha Hensley had the responsibility of determining Coley's punishment. Under Tennessee law, first-degree murder carried a sentence of life imprisonment, but the judge had discretion regarding parole eligibility. The prosecution argued for life without the possibility of parole. The defense requested that Coley be given some possibility of eventual release, citing his age and lack of prior criminal history. Angela was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement before sentencing. She stood at the podium, her prepared remarks clutched in trembling hands, and spoke directly to the man who had murdered her mother. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "You took my mother's life. You took my childhood. You took 42 years of answers. And for what? What did you gain from killing an 18-year-old waitress who never hurt anyone? You got to go home to your family while mine was destroyed. You got to watch your children grow up while I grew up without a mother. You got to live a normal life while we lived in a nightmare." She paused, looking directly at Coley, who kept his eyes down. "I spent my entire life wondering who you were, and now I know you're nobody. You're nothing. Just a coward who hurt someone weaker than you and then hid for 40 years. My mother fought back that night. She left her mark on you, and that mark finally brought you here." Judge Hensley's sentencing statement was concise and powerful. She described Christine's murder as a crime of particular brutality and cowardice. She noted that Coley had shown no remorse during the trial or afterward. She acknowledged the devastating impact on Christine's family and the broader community. And then she pronounced sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Mr. Coley, you will spend the remainder of your natural life in the custody of the Tennessee Department of Correction," Judge Hensley said. "You will never be released. This is the consequence of your actions on May 17, 1980, and your decision to remain silent while a family suffered for 4 decades. Coley was transported to the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution 2 days after sentencing. He was 65 years old, in declining health and facing the certainty that he would die in prison. His appeals would continue. His attorney had already filed notice of intent to appeal the conviction based on the genetic genealogy evidence, but the appeals were formalities, legal procedures that would almost certainly fail. The resolution of Christine's case generated national media coverage and renewed debate about the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Civil liberties organizations argued that the technique violated privacy rights. Law enforcement agencies countered that it was a powerful tool for solving cold cases and bringing justice to victims and families.
The debate would continue long after Coe's conviction. For Angela Monroe, the verdict and sentence brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief that her mother's killer had been identified and punished, anger that justice had taken 42 years to arrive, grief that remained as sharp as ever despite the passage of time. She had waited her entire life for answers, and now that she had them, she discovered that closure was more complicated than she had imagined. Detective Sarah Nongwin visited Christine's grave a week after the sentencing. She brought pink roses and stood in the cold November air, thinking about the 18-year-old woman she had never met but had come to know through investigation and testimony. The work of solving Christine's case had consumed 3 years of Nongwin's life and connected her to a tragedy that predated her own birth. The resolution felt both satisfying and incomplete. The small house on Woodlawn Avenue had new tenants who knew nothing of its history. The Highway 41 diner was gone, replaced by a chain restaurant with no memory of the young waitress who had once worked there. Clarksville continued to grow and change, as all cities do, carrying its history forward in ways both visible and hidden. In 2023, the City Council approved a memorial bench to be placed in a downtown park in Christine's memory. The plaque read simply,
Christine Marie Monroe, 1962–1980. Beloved daughter and mother, never forgotten. Angela attended the dedication ceremony with her grandmother, who was too frail to stand for long but insisted on being present. The bench became a quiet place of reflection, visited by people who remembered Christine and others who had only learned of her through news coverage of the trial. Someone always kept fresh flowers there, replacing them when they wilted, a small act of remembrance that acknowledged a life cut short and a justice delayed but finally delivered. Angela returned to Clarksville twice a year after the trial, once on her mother's birthday in February and once on the anniversary of her death in May. She would visit the grave, sit on the memorial bench, and allow herself to grieve in ways she had never fully permitted before. The conviction had given her permission to finally feel the full weight of her loss without the desperate need for answers that had haunted her for decades. James Edward Coley remained silent about his crime. He never admitted to what he did, didn't explain why he did it, and showed no regret for his actions. Records from prison showed that he kept to himself, did not take part in many programs, and had no contact with his old family. After he was found guilty, his children chose to cut ties with him. His wife filed for divorce. He had become invisible long before he actually died. The case of Christine Monroe was both a success and a sad story. It was a success for science and the hard work of detectives. It was sad because of the time lost and the delays in getting justice. The DNA Christine fought to get from her attacker in her last moments finally revealed the truth after 42 years of being unheard. The message it brought was clear and undeniable. Justice could wait through many years, even when it seemed hopeless. In Detective Sarah Neguin's office, there was the case file that used to fill many boxes. It has now been reduced, turned into digital files, and stored away. The physical proof was either put back in storage or destroyed, but the memory of the case stayed, showing that some puzzles could be solved if detectives didn't give up against time and challenges. And in a climate-controlled place in Tennessee, other boxes filled with other cases, other victims, and other families were waiting, each one seeming impossible to solve, until science and hard work came together to give the dead a voice and some peace to the living. Christine Monroe's story had an ending, but the struggle for justice for those forgotten would keep going, one cold case at a time, one DNA match at a time, one family at a time. The screen door that was crooked back in May 1980 was long gone, but the memory of what happened behind it would last. It showed both the harm people can do to each other and the hope that comes when the truth finally comes out. Make sure to subscribe, click the notification bell, and share this video with someone who enjoys true crime stories. Your help brings focus to cases that might be overlooked. Which cold case do you think deserves more attention? Leave a comment below. Every unsolved case is a family still looking for answers, still wishing for the closure that finally came to the Martinez family after almost 50 years of searching.